When I bought the 80-acre stretch of land just outside of Red Oak, Texas, it was nothing but overgrown pasture, a handful of oak trees, and an old barn that had seen better days. To most people, it looked like a forgotten piece of countryside, too far from town to be useful and too small for major agriculture. But to me, it was a blank canvas, a place I could quietly retire, raise a few cattle, and finally live without city noise or constant interference. I had inherited a modest sum from my late father and decided that land ownership was the most honest investment I could make. I filed the deed under my name, paid every bit of property tax on time, and even fenced off the boundaries just to make sure no one accidentally trespassed. For the first few years, everything went smoothly. I built a small cabin, installed solar panels, and grew comfortable with the rhythm of the land until one spring morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery grinding somewhere near the southern edge of my property. At first, I assumed it was county road work, but when I walked out and followed the sound, I couldn't believe what I saw. A construction crew, complete with bulldozers, concrete mixers, and survey stakes, was busy cutting into my land. The foreman barely looked at me when I demanded to know what was happening. He just shrugged and said, "We're breaking ground for Phase 1 of the Oak Ridge Estate subdivision. You might want to talk to the HOA office." HOA office? I didn't even live in a neighborhood, let alone belong to one. My jaw tightened as I realized something was terribly wrong. I went straight to the county records office, expecting to find some clerical mix-up that could be fixed with a signature. But when I asked the clerk to pull up my land file, she frowned and told me, "Sir, this tract has been rezoned and subdivided under Oak Ridge Estates, LLC. The developer filed ownership last year." I felt my heart sink. Someone had stolen my land on paper. Over the next week, I discovered that a powerful local developer named Brian Conway, who also chaired the regional HOA council, had acquired my land through a fake quitclaim deed and pushed it through zoning meetings while I was never notified. Conway was known for his shady tactics, buying up cheap land, bribing local inspectors, and flipping homes for a massive profit. But this time, he picked the wrong man. When I tried to confront him, his office secretary laughed and said, "Sir, you must be mistaken. That land belongs to Oak Ridge Estates now." I knew I needed a lawyer, but I also knew something Conway didn't. I had the original deed, signed, notarized, and recorded years before his fraudulent claim. I made copies and stored them in 3 different places. My attorney, a quiet but razor-sharp woman named Laura Bennett, told me to stay calm. "If they're building illegally on your land, let them," she said. "Every dollar they invest will work in your favor later. Just document everything." It went against my instincts to watch bulldozers tear up my pasture, but she was right. So, I stood by as months passed and construction exploded. Streets were paved, utilities installed, and houses rose one by one. Families began moving in, people who had no idea they were settling on stolen ground. I didn't blame them. They were victims too, in a way. But every time I drove past the Welcome to Oak Ridge Estates sign, my anger simmered hotter. By the time the HOA had completed 96 homes, the development was valued at over $40 million. They had paved over my land, built playgrounds, and even installed a private pool. They thought I was long gone. What they didn't know was that every photo, every drone shot, every county filing had been carefully documented. And when the last home was completed, when the HOA president cut the ribbon and shook hands with the mayor, I called Laura. "It's time," I said. She smiled through the phone. "Let's pull the deed." The day we filed the lawsuit, I could almost hear the collective gasp ripple through Oak Ridge Estates. My attorney, Laura Bennett, had spent months building an airtight case, one that not only proved ownership, but also documented the timeline of the fraud, the illegal zoning approvals, and the deliberate concealment by the developer and HOA board. We submitted the original deed, notarized and dated 5 years before Conway's fake quitclaim, along with tax receipts, aerial photos, and correspondence proving I had never sold or transferred my land. Within 48 hours, a judge issued an emergency injunction halting all property transactions within the development until the ownership dispute could be resolved. that meant no one could sell, refinance, or even legally occupy their homes without risking eviction. It was chaos. The HOA's phone lines were flooded with angry homeowners demanding answers. Conway himself went on local news, calling me a bitter recluse trying to exploit a paperwork error for profit. But when the reporter asked to see his proof of purchase, he couldn't produce a single authentic document. The county clerk's office, under pressure from the court, launched an internal investigation that uncovered something even worse. Conway had filed multiple fraudulent deeds across the region, often using shell companies to launder ownership. My land, it turned out, was just one of many he had stolen. Still, the homeowners in Oak Ridge Estates didn't know whom to believe. Some drove out to my cabin, yelling threats from their car windows. Others left notes begging me to find a way to work this out. I felt sorry for them, truly, but their anger wasn't my burden to carry. I had followed the law. They had built on stolen ground, and the irony wasn't lost on me. Conway's greed had turned 96 dream homes into ticking legal time bombs. The first court hearing drew so much attention that the local paper called it the biggest property dispute in Texas since the Red Oak rezoning scandal. Conway showed up with a squadron of lawyers in tailored suits, each armed with binders and bravado. Laura and I sat quietly at our table, our evidence neatly stacked. When the judge, a stern woman named Honorable Marjorie Ruiz, called the session to order, the air in the courtroom turned electric. Conway's team began with theatrics, claiming I was mistaken that paperwork discrepancies had occurred due to digitization errors. But when Laura stood up, her voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Your Honor," she said, holding up the original deed, "this document predates every single filing by Oak Ridge Estates, LLC. It was properly recorded, notarized, and taxed under my client's name. Every subsequent transfer is therefore fraudulent." She handed copies to the judge and opposing counsel, then played drone footage showing the progression of construction from untouched pasture to completed homes, all time-stamped, all on my land. Conway's face drained of color. The judge asked him directly, "Mr. Conway, did you or your company conduct a title search before beginning construction?" He stammered, "Well, my team handled those details." "So, you cannot personally verify ownership prior to development?" she pressed. "No, ma'am," he admitted quietly. That was the moment the courtroom turned. The murmurs grew louder as reporters scribbled furiously. Laura continued, revealing county meeting minutes that showed Conway had bribed a zoning official to fast-track approvals without proper notifications. Every layer of his empire began unraveling in front of the entire town. By the time the judge adjourned, she had granted an extended injunction and ordered Conway to produce all financial records related to the subdivision. Outside, the media swarmed. Cameras flashed, microphones appeared, and someone shouted, "How does it feel knowing 96 families might lose their homes?" I paused before answering. I didn't take their homes. I said evenly, "Someone stole my land, and they built their homes on it. I'm just taking back what's mine." The clip went viral overnight. By the next morning, the internet was ablaze with opinions, some calling me a hero for standing up to corporate corruption, others branding me a monster for threatening families. But I ignored the noise. Justice isn't about popularity, it's about principle. Meanwhile, Conway tried to rally the HOA, urging them to countersue me for malicious interference. The irony was almost laughable. He was trying to weaponize an HOA that technically existed on my property. Laura smirked when she read the motion. "Let him dig," she said. "The deeper he goes, the more evidence he buries himself under." And she was right. The HOA's own bylaws contained references to property boundaries that didn't match county plats, proving they had relied on Conway's fraudulent documents. Every legal filing they made only reinforced my case. Over the next few months, depositions exposed the rot inside Conway's operation. Former employees confessed that he'd ordered them to forge signatures and backdate zoning requests. Inspectors admitted to receiving bonuses for ignoring discrepancies. Even the county surveyor resigned after it came out he'd accepted a free home lot in exchange for falsifying boundary maps. Each revelation added weight to my claim, and each newscast further tarnished Conway's empire. By the time the trial date arrived, his once proud development firm had collapsed under federal investigation. But I wasn't celebrating yet. The residents of Oak Ridge Estates still lived on my land, and whatever the court decided, someone would have to pay. Laura and I spent long nights planning the endgame. You could force a full evacuation, she told me. You'd own every house, every road, every mailbox. But the optics would be brutal. People will hate you. I stared out at the dark fields where those 96 homes stood, their windows glowing against the horizon. Let them finish their lawns, I said quietly. Let them hang their curtains and think everything's fine. When the verdict comes, I'll decide who stays and who goes. It wasn't vengeance I wanted, it was accountability. For years, men like Conway had built fortunes by trampling small landowners, assuming nobody would fight back. Well, I wasn't nobody. I was the man who still held the deed, and soon enough, the court would make the whole town remember it. The courtroom was overflowing by the time the trial began. News outlets from across the state had swarmed Red Oak, and the air buzzed with the kind of tension that only comes when millions of dollars and hundreds of lives hang in the balance. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Laura, my hands folded, my expression calm. Across from us, Conway looked like a ghost of his former self. His once perfectly combed hair was now streaked with gray, his tailored suit hanging loosely on a thinner frame. His empire had started crumbling the moment the court accepted my deed as valid evidence, and now he was fighting not just for his reputation, but to stay out of prison. His lawyers had dwindled from a team of 7 to just 2, both clearly overworked and underconfident. But despite his fall from grace, I didn't underestimate him. Conway was still dangerous, a man cornered and desperate enough to do anything to salvage what he could. Judge Ruiz entered, and the murmurs died instantly. The bailiff called for order, and the trial officially commenced. Laura started strong, walking the court through every document, timeline, and correspondence we had. She made it crystal clear that my ownership was legal and continuous. The defendant, she said firmly, knowingly built 96 homes on property that did not belong to him, falsified legal documents to appear as the owner, and profited off the subsequent sale of those homes. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The evidence did all the talking. Then Conway's lawyer tried to argue that I had abandoned the land, that since I hadn't developed it or lived there full time, it was reasonable for the company to assume it was unused. Laura almost laughed. Reasonable, she shot back. You don't bulldoze first and check ownership later. The law doesn't work that way, and neither does common sense. The judge nodded, unimpressed by the defense. When it was Conway's turn to testify, the courtroom leaned forward as if collectively holding its breath. His attorney whispered something to him before he took the stand, but the damage was already done. Laura's cross-examination was merciless. Mr. Conway, she began, did you personally verify ownership of the property before construction began? I delegated that task, he said tersely. Delegated to whom? My acquisitions manager. And did that manager ever produce a signed bill of sale or title transfer for my client? Not to my knowledge. So, to clarify, you invested over $40 million developing a subdivision on land for which you had no verifiable ownership? He hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead. It was an oversight. Laura tilted her head slightly. An oversight that somehow involved forged signatures, falsified zoning documents, and secret payments to county officials? His silence was deafening. The gallery erupted in murmurs until the judge pounded her gavel for order. Over the following days, witness after witness sealed Conway's fate. A former surveyor confessed to being offered a brand new truck in exchange for redrawing boundary lines. A junior county clerk testified that her supervisor had ordered her to fast-track Conway's development filings, skipping standard verification steps. Even one of Conway's former partners, apparently seeking leniency in a related fraud case, took the stand and declared, "We all knew it was stolen land. He told us the real owner wouldn't fight back." When he said those words, Conway glared daggers at me from across the room, but I didn't flinch. That was the moment he realized I wasn't the quiet retiree he thought I was. I was the reckoning he'd been running from. Finally, after weeks of arguments and evidence, the closing statements arrived. Laura stood, composed and deliberate. "Your Honor," she said, "this isn't about money, it's about respect for the law." Mr. Conway thought he could rewrite property rights with a pen and a payoff. He thought one man wouldn't stand against a corporation. But justice doesn't belong to those with the most land or lawyers. It belongs to those with the truth. And the truth is simple. My client owns this property, and everything built upon it belongs to him by law. The courtroom was silent as she sat down. Conway's attorney gave his closing argument, a desperate plea that the court consider the innocent homeowners who would be displaced if I won. I understood the emotional appeal. It was his last weapon, but it couldn't erase the crime. Judge Ruiz recessed for deliberation. The wait was excruciating. For 2 full weeks, the town buzzed with speculation. News anchors debated what a ruling in my favor might mean. Some homeowners organized protests, waving signs that said, "Save our homes." Others directed their anger at Conway, realizing they'd been duped. I stayed quiet, tending to my land and waiting for the system to speak. Then, one crisp morning, the call came. Laura's voice was calm but heavy with meaning. "We won." The ruling was brutal in its precision. The court affirmed my ownership beyond dispute, declaring Conway's deeds fraudulent and void. Every structure, every utility, every square foot of pavement on that property was legally mine. Conway was ordered to pay damages equal to the assessed value of the homes plus restitution for illegal land use. The judge even referred the case to state prosecutors for criminal charges. The HOA's assets were frozen pending liquidation, and the residents were given 90 days to vacate or negotiate new leases with me. When I drove through Oak Ridge Estates that afternoon, I saw a neighborhood built on lies slowly coming to terms with reality. Some families were packing boxes, others stood in stunned silence on their lawns. A few waved me down, begging for mercy, and I listened to each one. I wasn't heartless. I knew they'd been misled. "I'll work with those who can prove good faith," I told them. "But I won't let injustice stand just because it's inconvenient." Many accepted my offer to stay as renters or buy their lots properly under my terms. The irony was painful. They could have owned their homes legally from the start if Conway hadn't been so greedy. As for Conway, he was finished. Within months, his company declared bankruptcy. Federal agents raided his offices, and he was indicted on multiple counts of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. The man who once strutted through council meetings as if he owned the county was now facing decades behind bars. I heard through the grapevine that he tried to sell off his remaining properties to pay legal fees, but most were tangled in similar lawsuits. His downfall was complete and poetic. Standing at the edge of my property that evening, I looked out over the rows of houses that now legally belonged to me. The sun dipped low, painting everything gold. What had started as a nightmare had become something far more profound, a lesson in patience, justice, and the quiet power of doing things the right way. The system may be slow, I thought, but when truth finally catches up, it's unstoppable. The months that followed the verdict were some of the strangest and most surreal of my life. Overnight, I went from being the quiet man who lived on the outskirts of town to the legal owner of an entire subdivision, 96 homes, a clubhouse, a playground, even the little artificial lake they dug for aesthetic appeal. It felt almost absurd. Reporters camped outside my gate for weeks, wanting to know what I planned to do with my community. I ignored most of them, focusing instead on rebuilding my peace of mind. Still, I couldn't escape the ripple effects of what had happened. Red Oak became a media circus, split between those who called me a hero for standing up to corruption and those who painted me as a heartless land baron evicting families. The truth was more complicated. I never wanted anyone to lose their homes, but I also couldn't ignore the law. Every one of those houses was built on land that was rightfully mine, and the system had finally recognized it. Now, I had to decide what to do next, not as a victim, but as the owner of something far bigger than I'd ever intended to control. Laura and I spent long hours in her office working through the logistics. The court had given residents 90 days to vacate or negotiate leases, but the process was messy. Some families left voluntarily, too angry or disillusioned to deal with me. Others came forward, genuinely remorseful and ready to cooperate. I met them one by one in the community center, which ironically now belonged to me as well. I didn't wear a suit or come with lawyers. I just sat at a folding table and listened. There was a young couple who'd sunk their life savings into their house, a widowed mother with 2 kids who cried as she handed me the fraudulent deed, an old veteran who said he'd rather rent than move again. It was humbling. I can't fix what Conway did to you, I told them, but I can make sure you're treated fairly going forward. For those who could afford it, I sold their homes back at discounted rates, legally, properly, and with clear titles. For others, I created long-term lease agreements that allowed them to stay without fear of eviction. I didn't make much profit from it, but that was never the goal. I wanted to restore order, to make something honest out of something rotten. The HOA, of course, was dissolved by court order. Their board members scattered, some facing lawsuits of their own for ignoring red flags during Conway's scheme. The clubhouse became a community hall under my management, open for town meetings and local events. Over time, the residents stopped seeing me as a villain and started viewing me as a neighbor. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of fighting against the HOA's tyranny, I had accidentally become the landlord of what used to be their crown jewel. Life, it seemed, had a wicked sense of humor. Meanwhile, Conway's downfall continued to make headlines. He was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy, sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Watching him led away in handcuffs brought me no joy, only closure. His empire crumbled. His properties were seized to pay restitution to victims across the state. The county launched reforms in zoning and property verification, implementing stricter safeguards to prevent another Oak Ridge fiasco. My case became a legal precedent in Texas land law, cited in courtrooms and textbooks as an example of how due diligence and persistence could overturn even the most elaborate corruption. I didn't set out to make history, but somehow I had. In the quiet aftermath, I finally returned to what I'd wanted all along: peace. My cabin still stood where it always had, surrounded by fields that now stretched uninterrupted all the way to the edge of the development. On evenings when the wind carried the distant sounds of children playing or dogs barking from the houses below, I didn't feel bitterness anymore. I felt balance. Justice had been served, the land restored, and the story complete. Sometimes I'd walk along the newly paved streets, nodding at the families who chose to stay. Some waved, some looked away. I didn't blame them either way. For them, I would always be a reminder of how fragile security can be when built on deception. One afternoon, as I was tending to the fence line, Laura drove up in her old Jeep, a grin on her face. "You're officially done," she said, handing me a thick envelope. Inside were the final legal filings, deeds, closing statements, tax documents, all in my name. No more hearings, no more press. It's all yours, free and clear. I looked out over the land that had once nearly been stolen from me and nodded slowly. Feels strange, I admitted. After all that, it almost doesn't feel real. She smiled. "That's the thing about justice," she said. "It's not loud. It's steady. It just takes time." We shared a quiet moment, the kind that only comes when a long battle is finally over. Months passed, and life in Oak Ridge Estates, now renamed Red Oak Meadows, settled into something normal. The families who stayed rebuilt their sense of community, this time without the suffocating rules of an HOA. I set up a trust to ensure the land's future couldn't be manipulated or stolen again, naming Laura as one of the trustees. I even donated part of the southern acreage to the county for a public park under one condition: that it always remain open and free. The same land Conway had tried to privatize for profit would now belong, in part, to everyone. It felt poetic, justice not just for me, but for the town itself. Every so often, I'd get a letter from people who'd followed my story. Some thanked me for standing up for landowners. Others shared their own tales of fighting corruption. One message stuck with me, written by a retired judge from another state. You did what most wouldn't. You let the wrongdoer dig his own hole and then filled it with truth. I kept that note pinned to my cabin wall as a reminder that integrity is slow, but it's relentless. As time moved on, the frenzy faded. Reporters moved on to new scandals, and the world forgot about the man who let 96 homes be built on his land just to pull out the deed in court. But I remembered every moment of it, the shock, the anger, the patience it took to watch injustice unfold, knowing the day of reckoning would come. Now, when I walk my property at sunset, the light falling over rooftops and trees, I feel no resentment, only satisfaction. I didn't just win back my land, I reclaimed something deeper. The belief that right still matters, that truth can outlast greed. And as the last rays of sun glint off the rooftops that once symbolized theft but now stand as monuments to justice, I whisper to myself, let them build. I'll always own the ground beneath their feet.